Good morning. This is Pastor Becca here on this Tuesday morning. I hope you're having a wonderful start to your day and to your week. I wanted to share just a brief word of the Lord with you from Exodus chapter 20 today. Exodus chapter 20. This Sunday, we're going to be starting a new sermon series called The New Normal. It's going to be a study in which we look at the Beatitudes, which of course are a part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount found in Matthew chapter 5. And so we're going to be taking a closer look at this, and particularly in this new way of life that we are called to live into as we live into this kingdom of God that Jesus ushers into our midst. In reality, as we're going to see in our text today, that this is not necessarily a new way of life that God is calling God's people to. In fact, if we look all the way back to God calling the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt, God has called God's people to be set apart, to be holy, to be different in the world. And Jesus continues that and reinterprets it in light of himself, in light of what God is doing through Christ. We see later on, if you continue in the Sermon on the Mount, you'll see Jesus say things like, "You have heard it said, but I say." And so Jesus oftentimes reinterprets the law, reinterprets that which is given to Israel to help them live in these holy and set apart ways in the world. But it has always been God's intention that God's people would live very differently than what they see modeled in the world. Their lives would not look like any other nation. Their lives would not look like any other group of people, but that they would reflect the very character and nature of God in everything that they do. And so we are going to look at Exodus chapter 20. It's going to be probably a familiar text for us, if many of you might have already looked, and it is the 10 Commandments. And so we're going to look at that this morning. Exodus chapter 20, beginning in verse 1. I invite you to hear the word of the Lord. And God spoke all these words. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth below, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpets and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us, for we will die." Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. And this is the word of the Lord for us this morning. Thanks be to God. Oftentimes when we think about the 10 Commandments, we think about rules, we think about law, we think about rules that are supposed to be followed. In these days, I can't help but think, when I think about rules, I think about students and teachers going back into classrooms. And oftentimes on that first day, especially in elementary school, the teacher will have a list of rules written out on the board or on a poster in the room. And part of that first day is going over those rules, going over those expectations of how you are going to act and behave and engage with one another in the classroom. In the same way, God gives these 10 commandments, these 10 laws or rules to Moses so that Moses might go and give them back to the people of Israel. If you remember at this point in Exodus, God has brought the people out of Egypt very recently. God has brought them to the other side of the Red Sea. They are now safe. And part of what God does in those first few days and weeks and even months when the people have come out of Egypt is to begin to prepare them for what life is going to look like on the other side. You see, God knows that the temptation for the people of Israel is to go back to what they know. Now, not necessarily go back physically to Egypt, although we even hear their wonderings about that when life gets hard. It was easier back in Egypt. But God wants to bring Egypt out of them, this way of life of Egypt out of them. You see, God knows that they've been shaped and formed by the ways of Egypt, whether or not they liked them in the moment. They saw a particular vision of life lived out in Egypt. They grew up seeing this. They grew up knowing this. This was all they had known before. This way of life where power and privilege are dominant. This way of life where you get what you want by putting another person under your thumb, by mistreating your neighbor. The goal to get ahead at whatever cost was ingrained in them by what they had seen and grown up knowing in the land of Egypt. And God knows that it's going to take some time. It's going to take some reshaping and reforming of these people to not only bring them physically out of Egypt, but to bring this way of Egypt out of them to where they are able to live in a new way, where they are able to imagine a different kind of future, where their lives are not pitted against one another, where they're not trying to get ahead at all costs, but where they learn what it means to live in right relationship with God and right relationship with one another. If you look at the 10 Commandments, that's entirely what it's about. It's about this way of living in love, living in right relationship with God. We have the first commandments that are all about living in right relationship with God. Do not misuse a name. Do not make an idol for yourself. Keep the Sabbath day. You have all these commands that are geared towards helping the people live into right relationship with God. And then the final commandments are those that help them live in right relationship with one another. These rules, these laws, these commands that are given to the people are not just to be nitpicky rules, but they are given in order to provide boundaries for life, to help them know best how to live into this new way of life that God is calling them to. A way of life that is led by love, a way of life that is found by this holy love that plays out in right relationship with both with God and with one another. And ultimately, that's what Jesus is doing too when we come to the Gospels. Last week, we heard the parable of the Good Samaritan. And in this, Jesus asked the expert of the law, what are the two greatest commands? And of course, he's talking about the law, the 10 Commandments. And the man says, love the Lord your God with all that you are, and love your neighbor as yourself. If you see, even in Jesus's kind of reinterpretation of the law, even in the people's understanding of the law, it boils down to this idea of love for God and love for neighbor. How do we live in right relationship in both of these areas of our lives? That is what God continues to call God's people to today, to be a people who are led by love. The reality is that our world still functions a lot like it did back in Egypt. where we find ourselves in this rat race to get ahead. And a lot of times to get ahead, whatever the cost, whatever you have to do, do it. The means justify the ends in our world. And we still live in a world where we live in this power hierarchy where power and privilege are at the top, and oftentimes the poor and the oppressed are put down or put under the thumb, or continue to be mistreated at the bottom, just like the Hebrew slaves were in Egypt. And yet in the midst of this world that we live in the midst of this world that helps form and shape us, that we have grown up in, as the people of God today, as those who walk in this way of Jesus, God calls the way of the world out of us, just like God called the way of Egypt out of Israel. We are to be a people holy and set apart, a people who are guided not by trying to get ahead, not by pride, not by power or privilege, but a people who are led by love, a people who do our very best to live in right relationship with God and right relationship with one another, a people whose very lives reflect the character of our holy God in the world that we live in. I'm excited about this upcoming sermon series. I'm excited to go through the Beatitudes and take a deeper look at just what this strange way of life looks like that God and Christ are calling us to. So we are looking forward to that. My prayer for us today is that in everything that we do, that we might be mindful of this way of life that God calls us to. In every situation, how can we live out our love for God and our love for neighbor? Church, receive this benediction. May the peace of Christ be with you today. And as you go throughout your day, in every situation, conversation, and decision that you face, may you be led by the love of our holy God. Blessings.